Here's how to make my favorite sourdough focaccia. It's really fun to make, it's golden brown on the outside, soft and fluffy on the inside, and it's got a crispy fried bottom that sounds like this when you scrape it with a knife. To make this sourdough focaccia, start by taking 25 grams of sourdough starter out of the fridge sometime in the afternoon because you're going to want to feed your starter early so that you can mix your dough in the evening before you go to bed. Take that 25 grams of starter and feed it 50 grams of water and 50 grams of plain white bread flour. Mix everything together so that it becomes kind of like a pancake batter in consistency. Then mark the top of the starter with a rubber band, cover up the jar with a lid, and let it rise for 4 to 6 hours or until it's doubled in size like this. My starter took almost exactly 6 hours before it was doubled in size and ready to use. Now you can mix your dough. Start by adding 325 grams of water to a mixing bowl. Then add 10 grams of salt. I'm using kosher salt, but you could use table salt or sea salt, whatever you can mix into the water. After the salt, get out your sourdough starter, which should be risen and doubled in size by now. Add 100 grams of sourdough starter directly to the water. If you followed the feeding that I recommended earlier, you should end up with 25 grams of sourdough starter left in the jar. You can take that 25 grams of starter, put it back in the fridge, and it'll be there waiting for you for the next time you want to bake sourdough bread. After stirring the starter into the water, add 450 grams of plain white bread flour. I'm using the King Arthur brand of bread flour in the blue bag. To mix the dough, just mix everything together with a spoon or a fork until almost all the dry bits of flour disappear and the dough becomes one cohesive mass. You might be thinking right now, when is he going to add the olive oil? Well, you'll add olive oil later, but right now it's just flour, water, salt, and sourdough starter. When the dough is holding together well like this, cover it up with a kitchen towel and let the dough rest for 30 minutes on your counter at room temperature. This will help the dough hold together better, and then you could add olive oil after the rest. 30 minutes later, take the cover off the dough and pop the dough back onto your kitchen scale. Then add 25 grams of your favorite extra virgin olive oil directly on top of the dough. The oil will add some softness and silkiness to the dough, as well as giving the bread an olive oil flavor that really makes focaccia what it's supposed to be. After you've added the 25 grams of olive oil on top of the dough, just squeeze the oil into the dough with your fingertips and with your hand. You're really just incorporating it by squeezing. After about a minute or two of squeezing the oil into the dough, you'll notice that the dough has kind of absorbed most of the oil. It starts disappearing into the dough, becoming one with it. That's exactly what you're looking for. So once you've got a smooth ball of dough without any loose pools of oil sitting in the dough, it's time to move on to the next step, which is the stretch and folds. You're going to be giving this dough 3 sets of stretch and folds with a half-hour rest in between each one. You can start the first set of stretch and folds right now. You're just taking an edge of the dough, stretching it up in the air, and pulling it over the top of the dough. Go around the bowl, repeating this stretching and folding process about 10 to 20 times until you feel the dough start to tighten up and resist your stretching. The main point of the stretch and fold process is to smooth out the dough, but also to develop gluten in the dough. So once you feel the dough start to tighten up and resist your stretching, that's when you know you can stop. Cover up the dough with a kitchen towel and let it rest for 30 minutes. A half hour later, it's time for the second set of stretch and folds, which should be easier than the first. The dough should be holding together better. Just give it about 4 or 5 stretches and folds this time, and the dough should start to tighten up and resist your stretching. Then cover the dough up again and let it rest for 30 minutes one final time. 30 minutes later, give the dough its last set of stretch and folds, give it 4 or 5 stretches once more. Then you could flip the dough over and let it rise overnight in the same mixing bowl, but I like to use this glass bowl with a lid so that I can see just how much the dough has truly risen overnight. So I put a little bit of oil in the glass bowl to prevent sticking, and then I flip the dough over so that the smooth side is facing up and the seam side is facing down in that bowl. Then I pop the lid on, and I let this rest overnight. Let your dough rise at room temperature on your kitchen counter for at least 6 to 8 hours, or until the dough about doubles in size. At exactly the 7-hour mark when I woke up in the morning, the dough was popping out of the bowl. It had completely doubled in size. And now it's time to shape the dough. And by shape the dough, I literally mean just put it into a baking pan. Get out a 9 by 13 inch metal cake pan, preferably a non-stick one like this one that I have here, and then add 25 grams of olive oil to the bottom of the pan. This oil will create an additional non-stick layer between the dough and the pan, but it will also flavor the dough, and it will really fry and crisp up the bottom of the focaccia, which will make it absolutely delicious. Once you've sufficiently oiled the bottom and the sides of your baking pan, get out your dough and flip it over into the oil. I'm turning my dough out so that the smooth side is facing down onto the bottom of the pan, and then I flipped it back over so that the smooth side was facing up again, and it has a nice layer of oil, a non-stick layer, on top and on bottom of the dough. So it's adequately covered with oil. And if you're worried that there's not enough olive oil in this recipe, we will be adding it one more time, so don't you worry. Now, some recipes might tell you to stretch out your dough completely so it fills the entire pan. You don't really need to be that aggressive with it. If you fully stretch out the dough now so that it fits the entire pan, you'll likely knock out most of the air bubbles inside of the dough during the process. So just lightly pull the dough so that it's a rectangular shape, but it won't quite fit the whole pan at this point. It won't quite reach all of the edges, and that's perfectly fine. The dough will rise and reach the edges of the pan during the long final proof, which is coming up next. Cover up your dough with an airtight lid if you have one, or with some plastic wrap like I'm doing here, and then let your dough proof, rising at room temperature for 3 to 5 hours, or until it almost completely fills the pan and puffs up and is looking something like this. Once the dough reaches the edges of the pan, it is now ready to dimple, top with your favorite toppings, and bake. But if you're not quite ready to bake yet, you can move your focaccia dough at this point to the fridge. It will kind of put it on pause. You can let it sit in there for up to 12 hours until you're ready to bake it. Then 30 minutes before you're ready to bake, preheat your oven to 450 degrees Fahrenheit. You can choose to bake this on a pizza steel or a baking stone, or just directly on the oven rack. Either way will work fine, so preheat your oven for 30 minutes. Then once the oven is preheated, get your dough out of the fridge if you were keeping it in there and uncover it. Another good sign that it's ready to bake is it should be nice and jiggly like this when you shake it. Time to top and bake the sourdough focaccia. For this recipe, add the last addition of 25 grams of extra virgin olive oil directly on top of the dough, then gather your desired focaccia toppings. I'm just keeping things simple today with my favorite combination of dried rosemary and salt. Now it's time for everyone's favorite part of the focaccia making process, the dimpling. Get your fingertips moist with a little bit of that olive oil and press down until you feel the bottom of the pan. This creates peaks and valleys and bumps and ridges all throughout the dough that the olive oil is going to settle into, and the rosemary and salt are going to create these little flavor pockets all throughout the focaccia. Now just add the rest of your toppings. For me, it's just a few sprinkles of salt. Any kind of flaky sea salt would be really good here, but I'm just using my standard kosher salt, because I don't really like to buy extra salt just to be fancy. And then a few sprinkles of dried rosemary. I usually don't measure it, but it's probably a few teaspoons if I had to guess. And yes, you can use fresh rosemary instead of dried. I've tried this recipe both ways, but I actually do prefer the dried rosemary. I'm not sure why, but it makes things a lot easier for me. Now that your sourdough focaccia is dimpled and topped, you can see all those pockets of oil throughout the focaccia. It's time to bake. Take this to your 450 degree preheated oven and place it onto the rack or onto your baking stone, and bake this for 30 to 35 minutes. I find that there's no need to add extra steam to your oven, by the way. 32 minutes later, my focaccia was looking nice and golden brown, so I took it out of the oven. At this point, slide your focaccia out of its nonstick pan and onto some kind of rack to cool. Let it cool for at least 30 minutes. The focaccia will have a better texture and be a lot more delicious if you wait. Okay, it is now time for slicing and the taste test, and one of my favorite parts of the focaccia, the bottom. The focaccia bottoms always look something like the surface of the moon and are absolutely crispy and delicious. And that crispy golden brown exterior of the focaccia contrasts perfectly with the soft, white, fluffy interior. The texture of this focaccia is a delicious balancing act, being both soft and crunchy, as well as tender and chewy at the same time. It's a fantastic bread, great for parties and charcuterie board spreads. Now for the taste. This bread is exploding with flavor, which should not be a surprise since there is 3 or 4 times olive oil in this bread, depending on how you count it. The fried bottom of the focaccia is absolutely delicious, and the soft and fluffy interior of the bread is really rich from that olive oil and has a great mildly tangy flavor from the sourdough starter. This is one of those long fermented breads that I think using sourdough starter instead of baker's yeast really makes a difference. And whether you're a new or an experienced sourdough bread baker, I really think there couldn't be a better bread to make.